Next, we're going to talk about the budget constraint. There's a couple of things that really defines the budget constraint. Now, just stop and think about this. How many of y'all have ever heard as a child, money doesn't grow on trees? Well, I've heard it, and that was usually whenever I was asking for a couple too many things, and my parents were tired of spending money on me, so they said, money doesn't grow on trees. So I'm sure you've heard that same saying before. Well, it's basically saying that everybody has a limited amount of money. Money doesn't grow on trees. You can't just get an infinite amount of money or anything like that. There is a finite amount of money that anyone can spend, that they actually have to spend. That limited amount of money, that finite amount of money, that limit is our budget constraint. So a budget constraint, this budget constraint defines the feasible set of consumption choices facing a consumer. You see, because everybody has a finite amount of money that they can spend, they must basically take that limited amount of money and decide how they're going to allocate that money to maximize their satisfaction. So how are they going to use their limited amount of money? Or how are they going to use this budget constraint? So that budget constraint tells us all of the possible ways that a consumer can actually use their money, their resources for consumption. What are all their consumption choices? And this budget constraint depends on a couple things. First and foremost, it's going to depend on the price of the good and the income of the consumer. So whenever we're talking about the budget constraint, it shows that feasible set of consumption choices. And if the income of the consumer is going up, well, now their feasible set of choices has now increased. They can now buy more simply because they're getting paid more. That being said, what happens if the price of the good changes? Say the price of the good falls. Now they can afford more of those goods. Even though the income never changed, they can buy more of those goods. Their set of consumption choices just changed again. So this budget constraint, it depends on the price of the good and the income of the consumer. So this budget constraint, it also leads into purchase. This budget constraint is limited by the amount of money that they have. You see, purchases of the consumer cannot exceed his or her own income. You can't spend more than you make. In today's society, you can actually try to do that by putting money on credit cards and taking out loans. And while that kind of gets you by for a little while, you do have to pay those loans back at some point in time. You have to pay off that credit card. So what you're doing is whenever you're taking out credit, you are foregoing future income that you got to put back towards that credit. But at the end of the day, you still cannot exceed your income. You might be able to exceed it for today and putting it on credit, but at some point in time, it's going to catch up with you. So purchases of the consumer cannot exceed his or her own income. So another quote that kind of defines this budget constraint is something like saying, I wanted to purchase it. I want that item. I wanted the latest and greatest cell phone, but I just could not afford it. Well, it's saying that that's your budget constraint right there. You could not afford it. You are dealing with a finite amount of money. So this budget constraint is defining these feasible set of consumption choices. So household consumption decisions. Whenever a household is talking about, or whenever we're talking about consumers, we typically talk about a household. A household is, for all intents and purposes, a family unit. It might be a mother and a father and their children, or the mother and the children, or the father and their children, or something like that. But oftentimes, whenever we talk about consumer purchases, we talk about household consumption decisions, simply because we have to include purchases made for maybe kids who aren't buying that stuff like the parents are. So these household consumption decisions, whenever we're talking about these decisions, that income should include all forms of family income. All forms, and that's including, say, money made by the father, money made by the mother, maybe even money made by the kids, because we are including that all into that household consumption. And maybe part of that household consumption is a kid who made some money doing a paper route, takes his money and goes out and buys a new gaming system or something like that. Well, that is part of that household consumption decision. So whenever we're talking about income, it should include all forms of the family income, but it should also exclude tax obligations in this term called disposable income. So the disposable income is the net income or the total amount of revenue or money that came into the houses minus taxes. And this disposable income is pretty important because it talks about how much money this household can truly spend. They really can't spend these taxes. They can't spend the money that's going to taxes because that has to go to the U.S. government. But yet this disposable income is what they can spend on these household consumption decisions. So that's what we're really looking at. We're looking at this net income, the total amount of money minus the taxes to give us our disposable income, and that's what we use when we're analyzing our consumption decisions for a household. Now another thing that we must talk about when we're looking at these budget constraints is that these budget constraints include time limits of some sort. So we're looking at max expenditures per something like a day or a week or a month. It has a time limit. A lot of times, whenever families, maybe they are a salary-based income and they get paid monthly. Well, they're going to look at maybe what's their budget constraint for that month. Or maybe you have people who are paid weekly, and maybe their budget constraint is how much they can spend weekly. Or maybe if you have an allowance with a kid, maybe it's how much they can spend per day on food at school or something like that. So these budget constraints do include a time limit. Now, we did talk about disposable income over here, and I want to introduce you to something that you might have already seen before, but just to kind of recap. It's the deal called Engels Law. So Engels has this law, and it states that as disposable income rises, the percentage of income spent on food falls. Basically, the more money you make as a percentage of that income, the less you spend on food. So think about it this way. Food is a necessity. Everybody has to have food to survive. You must have food. So if you're making, I don't know, maybe $100 a week, and it costs $75 a week for your family to survive, and that's just food expenditures. Well, and if it costs $75 for that family to survive that week, you're spending 75% of your income on food. Now, what happens if your income all of a sudden changes to $200 a week? And you stop and you think about it and you say, you know, I'm going to go ahead and spend a little bit more on food. I'm going to spend another $25 a week on food, or a month on food, or whatever it is, whatever that time limit is, but you're making $200. Well, now all of a sudden, you're spending 50% of your income on food. No longer that 75%. Why? Because you already spent the $75 to buy the majority of the stuff you already needed, and the extra $25 to buy maybe more high-end foods. But there's a certain point where you don't need to buy or spend as much money on food because you've already got it. So what we find is with this Engels Law is that as disposable income rises, the percentage of income spent on food falls. Now the total amount we spend on food might rise, but the percentage of that income is spent on food will fall. So lower income families, they typically spend a higher percentage on food. Whereas if you move into maybe higher income families spend a lower percentage on food, and they spend more on luxury items. Why? Because, well, they've already got all the food that they need to survive, and they got leftover money, so they're spending it somewhere else. So how does the U.S. stack up whenever we talk about Engels Law? Well, we find that in the U.S., we have a relatively high per capita national income. So we spend roughly 10% of our disposable income, just 10%. A dime out of every dollar you make in disposable income will go to food. Whereas if you compare that to less developed countries, because of this Engels Law, they typically spend a lot more on food because they are needing to spend the majority of their income just to survive. Whereas if you get into the higher income, they can spend whatever they need to survive, and then they have a lot left over, meaning they have a higher percentage to spend somewhere else.